Imagine living in a world where eating a sandwich on the wrong day could get you executed, or where your government hired professional sniffers to hunt down your morning coffee. Throughout human history, lawmakers have proven one thing beyond all doubt: having the power to write rules doesn't mean you have the brain cells to make them sensible. From ancient emperors with bizarre obsessions to modern politicians with too much time on their hands, humanity has created laws so monumentally stupid that they make you question everything about our species. Today, we're diving into 50 of the most ridiculous, baffling, and downright idiotic laws ever written. Buckle up, because this journey through legal insanity will leave you grateful for every dumb rule you've ever complained about. Let's begin. Rule 1 in ancient Sparta: being single wasn't just lonely, it was legally punishable. If a Spartan man remained unmarried past a certain age, the state considered him a disgrace to society. The punishment was brutally humiliating. During the coldest winter months, these bachelors were forced to march naked through the public marketplace while singing songs that mocked their own failure to find a wife. Citizens were legally encouraged to laugh at them and throw insults. The Spartans believed that unmarried men were useless to the state because they weren't producing future soldiers. It was essentially government-mandated public shaming for your relationship status. Makes your mother asking about grandchildren at family dinners seem pretty tame, doesn't it? Would you rather face Spartan winter nudity or another awkward Thanksgiving conversation about why you're still single? Rule 2: ancient Egypt took cat worship to a level that would make modern cat ladies look like casual pet owners. Killing a cat, even by complete accident, was considered one of the most serious crimes in Egyptian society. The punishment ranged from severe beatings to public execution, depending on the circumstances. But here's where it gets truly insane. According to historical accounts, when a house caught fire, Egyptians were legally expected to save the cats before saving their own belongings or even their children. Some historians report that people would form human chains around burning buildings specifically to prevent cats from running into the flames. If a cat died in the fire, the family could face legal consequences for failing to protect the sacred animal. It's the ultimate proof that humans have been servants to cats for thousands of years. Is your cat getting the royal treatment it legally deserves, or are you living dangerously? Rule 3: Japan's Metabo law sounds like something from a dystopian novel, but it's completely real and still enforced today. Since 2008, Japanese companies have been legally required to measure the waistlines of all employees between the ages of 40 and 74. Men must stay under 33.5 inches, and women must stay under 35.4 inches. If too many employees exceed these limits, the company faces massive government fines that can reach into the millions of yen. This means your boss has a financial incentive to monitor your lunch choices and gym attendance. Imagine sitting down for your annual performance review, expecting feedback on your sales numbers, only to have HR pull out a measuring tape instead. The government's goal was to combat rising obesity rates and reduce healthcare costs, but the result is a nation where your waistline is literally your employer's business. Would you quit a job that required you to stay thin, or would you finally start that diet you've been putting off for years? Rule 4: the Italian beach town of Heraclea has declared war on sandcastles, and they're not joking around. Local authorities passed a law making it illegal to build sand structures on public beaches, with fines reaching up to €250. Their reasoning: sandcastles supposedly block the paths of lifeguards, create tripping hazards for tourists, and leave unsightly holes when they collapse. This means every child with a plastic bucket and shovel is technically a potential criminal in the eyes of Italian law. Imagine spending 3 hours perfecting your castle's moat system, complete with seashell decorations and a driftwood drawbridge, only to have a police officer demand its immediate demolition. The law also bans digging holes deeper than a few inches, so forget about burying your friend in the sand. Does this make your local beach's no glass bottles rule seem incredibly reasonable by comparison? Rule 5: Emperor Qin Shi Huang of ancient China had a unique approach to defining legal adulthood that had nothing to do with age. Instead, your legal status was determined entirely by your height. The emperor decreed that only individuals who reached approximately 4 feet 11 inches tall could be prosecuted as adults in court. If you were shorter than this threshold, you were legally considered a child regardless of whether you were 15 or 50 years old. This created an absurd situation where grown men carried official height certificates and developed elaborate techniques to appear shorter during legal proceedings. Some would hunch dramatically, wear flat shoes, or dig small trenches to stand in when being measured. Being short became the ultimate legal loophole for avoiding taxes, military conscription, and criminal prosecution. It's probably the only time in human history when people actively tried to look less tall. If your legal rights depended entirely on your height today, would you be an adult, or would you be shopping in the children's section for legal immunity? Rule 6: the Qin dynasty of China didn't just regulate behavior, they regulated emotions with terrifying precision. Under their legal code, men were strictly forbidden from crying in public, especially during court proceedings, funerals, festivals, or any official state events. Tears were viewed as a sign of weakness that could undermine the strength of the empire itself. If a man was caught shedding tears, he faced punishments ranging from public humiliation to having his beard and eyebrows forcibly shaved off as a permanent mark of shame. In a society where facial hair symbolized masculinity and honor, this was considered a fate worse than many physical punishments. The law essentially told citizens to suppress their grief or face the consequences. It's the original "stop crying, or I'll give you something to cry about" policy, except enforced by the actual government with legal penalties. How long do you think you could hold back tears if your emotions were a criminal offense? Rule 7. Frederick the Great of Prussia had a personal vendetta against coffee that he turned into national policy. The king believed that coffee was a foreign luxury, undermining the German tradition of drinking beer, and he was determined to stop its spread. But Frederick didn't just impose taxes on coffee, he created an elite unit of disabled war veterans called the Kaffeeschnufflers, literally translated as coffee sniffers. These men were given legal authority to patrol the streets of Prussian cities, sniffing the air for the telltale aroma of roasting coffee beans. When they detected the scent, they had the power to enter homes, search for illegal coffee supplies, and impose massive fines on anyone caught brewing the forbidden beverage. Imagine enjoying your morning cup in peace when suddenly a government-certified sniffer kicks down your door because he smelled your latte from the street. Is there any drink you love enough to risk a specialized police force hunting you down? Rule 8. The Code of Hammurabi, one of history's oldest legal documents, took customer service extremely seriously. Tavern owners in ancient Babylon operated under laws that would terrify modern bar managers. If a tavern keeper was caught watering down the beer or charging unfair prices, the punishment wasn't a fine or a bad review on ancient Yelp. The penalty was death by drowning. The guilty owner would be seized by authorities and thrown into the nearest river to face their fate. The Babylonians believed that honest commerce was sacred and that cheating customers was a crime against the gods themselves. This made running a bar one of the most dangerous professions in the ancient world, where every pint you poured could be your last if a customer complained. Do you think modern bartenders would be more generous with their pours if their lives depended on customer satisfaction? Rule 9. For centuries, both French and English law maintained one of history's strangest medical policies, the royal touch. This wasn't just a belief, it was a legally mandated ritual that monarchs were required to perform. The kings of France and England were legally obligated to touch sick subjects who suffered from scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that caused swelling in the lymph nodes. The ritual, called touching for the king's evil, required the monarch to personally lay hands on thousands of afflicted citizens who lined up for the royal healing. Some kings touched over 1,500 people in a single ceremony. Charles II of England reportedly touched nearly 100,000 people during his reign. The state literally turned the king's body into a government-certified medical treatment, complete with official ceremonies and documentation. It's proof that thoughts and prayers were once an actual line item in the national budget. Would you wait in line for hours to be touched by a politician if the law said it might cure your illness? The city-state of Megara once passed a law that would make every modern wedding planner weep. Concerned that middle-class families were bankrupting themselves trying to compete with lavish aristocratic weddings, the government decided to legally cap wedding expenses. The law dictated the maximum number of guests allowed, the specific price limit for the bride's dress, and even how much could be spent on food and decorations. Violating these regulations meant facing serious legal penalties for the crime of having too nice a wedding. It was the ancient world's attempt at preventing keeping up with the Joneses by literally making expensive celebrations illegal. The law tried to protect families from debt, but it also meant that the government had final approval over your wedding aesthetic. If lawmakers today told you that your wedding budget couldn't exceed the price of a used Honda Civic, would you still say "I do"? Or would you elope to avoid the paperwork? Rule 11. In 1571, the English Parliament passed a law that turned every citizen's head into a mandatory advertisement for the wool industry. The Cappers Act required every male over the age of 6, except for nobility and persons of high degree, to wear a wool cap on Sundays and all holy days. If you were caught with a bare head or wearing a cap made of any other material, you faced a fine of 3 farthings for each day of violation. The law was explicitly designed to boost the struggling English wool trade by forcing the entire population to become involuntary customers. It essentially turned fashion into economic policy, with the government mandating what you wore on your head to save failing businesses. The law remained on the books for decades before finally being repealed. Imagine being legally required to wear a specific brand of hat every weekend just because a particular industry was having a bad year. Would you comply, or would you risk the fine for the freedom to go hatless? Rule 12. Tokugawa Tsunayoshi, the 5th shogun of Japan's Tokugawa dynasty, earned the nickname the Dog Shogun for laws that made animal welfare a matter of life and death. His laws of compassion, enacted in the late 1600s made harming any animal a capital offense punishable by death. Dogs received particular protection, with the shogun building massive government kennels that housed over 50,000 stray dogs at taxpayer expense. While common citizens struggled with poverty and famine, the Soi dogs lived in luxury with dedicated caretakers and premium food. One famous case involved a man who was executed simply for accidentally hitting a dog with a stone. The laws became so oppressive that citizens lived in fear of any interaction with animals. The shogun's personal obsession had become the law of the land, proving what happens when a ruler's hobby becomes everyone's legal nightmare. If you became ruler for a day, what strange personal interest would you force on your entire nation? Rule 13. Since the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte, French law has technically made it illegal to name your pig Napoleon. This law was enacted specifically to protect the emperor's dignity from the indignity of being associated with farm animals. While Napoleon controlled most of Europe and commanded massive armies, apparently the thought of a pig sharing his name was too much for his ego to handle. The truly absurd part is that while Napoleon himself has been dead for over 200 years, this law has never been officially repealed. Technically speaking, the reputation of every pig in France is still a matter of high-level national concern. The law has inspired countless jokes and even influenced George Orwell's decision to name the villainous pig in Animal Farm Napoleon. It's a hilarious reminder that even the most powerful dictators can be surprisingly insecure about the strangest things. Would you risk naming your pig after a historical figure if it meant potentially breaking a 200-year-old law? Rule 14. Medieval. Iceland had strict laws governing romance that would make modern dating apps seem like total freedom. The Grágás Law Code, Iceland's medieval legal framework, made it illegal to compose love poetry about someone without obtaining their family's explicit written permission first. The Icelanders didn't view poetry as a harmless expression of affection. Instead, they considered romantic verses to be a form of seductive magic or social defamation that could damage a family's honor and reputation. If you were caught writing sonnets for your crush without the proper authorization, you faced punishments ranging from heavy fines to complete banishment from the community. This meant that every love letter required a legal consultation before delivery. Imagine having to submit your Tinder messages to a family attorney for approval before hitting send. Does knowing this make the awkwardness of modern dating seem significantly more manageable? Rule 15. In the 1860s, the British government responded to the terrifying new technology of automobiles with a law that seems designed to prevent progress itself. The Locomotive Act, also known as the Red Flag Act, capped the maximum speed of any self-propelled vehicle at a blazing 4 miles per hour in the country and 2 miles per hour in towns. But the speed limit wasn't even the most absurd part. The law required every automobile to be preceded by a man walking at least 60 yards ahead, carrying a red flag during the day and a red lantern at night to warn pedestrians and horses of the approaching vehicle. This meant that cars were legally required to travel slower than a person could walk, completely defeating the entire purpose of motorized transportation. The law remained in effect until 1896, significantly slowing Britain's automotive industry while other countries raced ahead. It's the ultimate example of bureaucracy desperately trying to pump the brakes on innovation. Would you buy a car that legally couldn't go faster than your grandmother's walking speed? Rule 16. Ancient Athens had a legal system so thorough that it put inanimate objects on trial for murder. If a falling statue, a collapsing roof tile, or any other object caused the death of a citizen, that object was formally charged with homicide and brought before a special court called the Prytaneum. The object would be tried with full legal proceedings, including witness testimony and judicial deliberation. If found guilty, the murderous object was formally sentenced to banishment from the city and physically thrown beyond the borders of Athens, often into the sea. The Athenians believed that blood guilt attached to anything that caused death, and that removing the object would cleanse the city of spiritual pollution. It's the original version of blaming the tool instead of the circumstances. If you could put one annoying household object on trial for crimes against your sanity, which would you sentence to permanent exile? Rule 17. British colonial India provides history's perfect example of a law backfiring so spectacularly that it became a famous economic principle. During the colonial period, the British government became concerned about the large cobra population in Delhi and decided to solve the problem with financial incentives. They offered a cash bounty for every dead cobra brought to government offices. Initially, the plan worked perfectly as people hunted snakes enthusiastically, but soon, enterprising, locals realized they could make more money by breeding cobras specifically to kill them and collect the reward. When British officials discovered the cobra farms, they immediately cancelled the bounty program. In response, the cobra breeders, no longer having any use for their now worthless snakes, released them all into the wild. The result was a cobra population significantly larger than before the program began. can. This phenomenon is now known as the Cobra effect, the term economists use when a solution makes a problem worse. What well-intentioned rule have you seen backfire spectacularly? Rule 18, the Spartans weren't satisfied with just publicly shaming unmarried men. They also conducted mandatory government body inspections that would make any modern gym teacher blush every 10 days. Spartan youth were required to strip completely naked and present themselves before city officials called ephors for a mandatory physical examination. These inspectors would carefully assess each young man's physique, muscle tone, and overall fitness level. If a youth appeared soft, overweight, or insufficiently muscular, he wasn't just embarrassed, he was publicly beaten as punishment for his perceived laziness. The Spartans believed that physical fitness was directly connected to military readiness, and that a fat citizen was essentially a traitor to the state. Your body literally belonged to Sparta, and letting it get out of shape was a crime against your country. If your local government instituted mandatory bi-weekly weigh-ins with physical punishment for weight gain, how would your fitness took voter participation so seriously that they literally marked citizens who tried to skip out on democracy? When the assembly was scheduled to meet, officials would sweep through the marketplace and public areas carrying long ropes that had been freshly dipped in wet red paint. Anyone caught loitering instead of heading to the assembly would have the rope pressed against their clothing, leaving a bright crimson stain that couldn't be easily removed. This red badge of laziness served as public proof that you had tried to avoid your civic duty. Citizens marked with the red paint faced immediate fines and public shame, as everyone could see evidence of their political apathy right there on their clothes. It was the ancient equivalent of a public "I didn't vote" sign that you couldn't take off. If your government started using visible markers to identify people who skipped elections, would you become more politically engaged or just buy darker clothes? Rule 21. If you've ever played Ding Dong Ditch as a child, congratulations, you've committed a crime that London police have been tracking since 1839. Under Section 54 of the Metropolitan Police Act, it is explicitly illegal to willfully and wantonly disturb any inhabitant by pulling or ringing any doorbell or knocking at any door without lawful excuse. Victorian authorities took the peace and quiet of London residents extremely seriously, viewing doorbell pranks as a genuine breach of public order worthy of magistrate attention. While the law was originally intended to prevent harassment and disturbances in an era before electronic surveillance, it technically remains in force today. This means that every teenager who rings a doorbell and runs away is committing an offense that has been illegal for nearly 2 centuries. It's one of the few laws specifically designed to target annoying children in the name of public sanity. Is there a modern prank you think should carry an official legal penalty? Rule 22. For 24 years, the humble potato was legally banned in France because the government believed it caused leprosy. From 1748 to 1772, the French Parliament prohibited the cultivation, sale, and consumption of potatoes based on the widespread but completely false belief that eating them would spread the disease. It took a clever pharmacist named Antoine-Augustin Parmentier to change both the law and public opinion through brilliant marketing rather than scientific argument. Parmentier planted a field of potatoes on the outskirts of Paris and surrounded it with armed guards during the day, making the forbidden vegetable look like an exclusive luxury. At night, he intentionally removed the guards, knowing that curious Parisians would sneak in and steal the potatoes, thinking they must be incredibly valuable. His plan worked perfectly. Soon everyone wanted the mysterious vegetable that required military protection, and the leprosy stigma was forgotten. It's proof that good marketing can overcome any law, no matter how stupid. Rule 23. During Oliver Cromwell's Puritan rule of England in the 17th century, Christmas celebrations were literally criminalized. The Puritan government viewed holiday festivities as excessive, wasteful, and irreligious. So they passed laws banning mince pies, Christmas puddings, and other festive foods, specifically on December 25th. Soldiers were given legal authority to enter private homes and seize any holiday pastries or decorations they discovered. Making or eating a mince pie on Christmas Day was an act of rebellion against the state, turning every grandmother with a recipe book into a potential revolutionary. The goal was to transform Christmas into a day of fasting and somber reflection rather than celebration. For over a decade, the holiday that we now associate with joy and feasting was officially cancelled by government decree. Imagine armed officers busting down your door on Christmas morning because they smelled cinnamon and nutmeg wafting from your kitchen. Would you risk imprisonment for a piece of festive pie? Rule 24 King Frederick William I of Prussia had an obsession, so bizarre that it turned his army into a human collection. He created the Potsdam Giants, an elite regiment where every single soldier was required to be at least 6 feet tall, an extraordinary height for the 18th century. To fill his regiment, the king passed laws authorizing his agents to essentially kidnap tall men from across Europe. Prussian diplomats would scout foreign countries for exceptionally tall individuals, and elaborate schemes were developed to lure or abduct them to Prussia. The king didn't stop there. He also attempted to breed taller soldiers by legally forcing his giants to marry the tallest women available. Foreign nations sent tall men as diplomatic gifts, knowing the king valued them more than gold. The regiment served no practical military purpose. It was simply a royal hobby that had been given the full force of law. Do you think you'd still want to be tall if it made you a target for state-sponsored kidnapping? Rule 25 France has a law that makes the phrase, "till death do us part," sound like a minor bureaucratic inconvenience. Under Article 171 of the French Civil Code, it is entirely legal to marry a deceased person. To make this happen, the surviving partner must prove that the couple had genuine intentions to marry before the death occurred, and must obtain personal written approval from the President of France. If approved, the marriage is backdated to the day before the death, making the union legally valid. The law was originally created to help pregnant women whose fiancés died before the wedding, allowing them to legitimize their children. However, it has since been used in various circumstances, including by a woman who married her partner after he was killed in a traffic accident. It's a strange, bittersweet piece of legislation that treats death as just another hurdle that can be overcome, with sufficient paperwork. Would you marry the love of your life even if they couldn't attend their own wedding? Rule 26, the city of Milan, Italy, has an ancient ordinance that attempts to legally mandate human happiness. According to this local law, citizens are technically required to smile at all times while in public spaces. The only legal exceptions to this mandatory cheerfulness are for people attending funerals or visiting hospitals. While no one today is actually handing out tickets for frowning, the law has never been officially removed from the books. It was originally enacted to make the city appear more welcoming and pleasant to visitors and traders. The lawmakers apparently believed that they could legislate mood and force an entire population to project happiness through legal threat. It's the ultimate example of bureaucratic absurdity, the idea that you can fine away unhappiness. How long do you think you could maintain a legally mandated smile before your facial muscles staged their own rebellion? Rule 27, according to a persistent Scottish tradition that many locals treat as genuine law, if a stranger knocks on your door and asks to use your toilet, you are legally obligated to let them in. While legal experts debate whether this was ever actually codified into formal law, many Scottish people treat it as a matter of national honour and hospitality. The supposed rule essentially transforms every private bathroom in Scotland into a quasi-public facility available to any passing stranger with an urgent need. Some historians trace this tradition to ancient laws of hospitality that required homeowners to provide aid to travellers, while others suggest it's simply a cultural myth that has taken on the weight of law through generations of retelling. Either way, the belief persists and is frequently cited by tourists and locals alike. Would you feel comfortable letting a complete stranger into your home simply because an old custom said you must? Rule 28, medieval England had a legal method for determining guilt that turned every trial into a high-stakes eating contest. The trial by Morcel, also known as the Corsned, was primarily used for members of the clergy accused of crimes. The accused was forced to eat a piece of consecrated bread or cheese, typically about an ounce in size, while prayers were recited over them. The belief was that if the person was guilty, God would cause them to choke on the food, unable to swallow their own sinfulness. If they managed to eat the morsel smoothly and without difficulty, they were declared innocent and freed. This meant that your entire legal fate could depend on whether you had a dry mouth or anxiety-induced swallowing difficulties that day. It essentially transformed the court system into a religious competitive eating event where the judge was the Almighty and the evidence was a piece of sourdough. If your innocence depended on successfully swallowing a single bite of food, how confident would you be in your own throat? Sweden maintained strict laws against spontaneous dancing that would have made Footloose seem like a documentary. Under Swedish regulations, bars, restaurants, and clubs were legally required to obtain a special dancing permit before allowing any patrons to dance on the premises. If a particularly catchy song came on, and customers started moving to the music without the proper paperwork in place, the establishment owner could face serious fines or even lose their liquor license entirely. This meant that every foot tap, hip sway, and impromptu dance move was potentially a legal violation that could shut down a business. The law was finally reformed in 2016 after years of criticism and mockery, but for generations, Swedish nightlife operated under the constant threat of dance-related legal consequences. It's the kind of law that sounds like the premise of a comedy movie, but with more meatballs and significantly more IKEA furniture. Would you risk your favorite bar's existence by busting a move without checking their permit status? Rule 30. The iconic black gondolas of Venice aren't a traditional choice. They're the result of a 16th century legal crackdown on conspicuous consumption. During the Renaissance, wealthy Venetian families engaged in fierce competition to decorate their private gondolas with the most expensive materials possible. Gold leaf, precious fabrics, elaborate carvings, and silk cushions transformed these boats into floating displays of wealth. The spending became so excessive that the government intervened, passing a law decreeing that all gondolas must be painted a uniform, somber black. The only exceptions allowed were for gondolas belonging to high-ranking officials. The law was designed to end the social rivalry and prevent families from bankrupting themselves trying to out-decorate their neighbors. It effectively democratized the waterways by making everyone's boat equally plain. The gondolas have remained black ever since, a lasting reminder of a government's attempt to enforce economic equality through mandatory aesthetic conformity. Should we bring back similar laws for luxury cars today? Rule 31. In the Norwegian town of Longyearbyen, on the Svalbard archipelago, it is technically illegal to die. This isn't because the local government has cracked the code to immortality, it's because of terrifying practical concerns about permanently frozen corpses. The town sits on permafrost so intense that bodies buried there never decompose. Scientists discovered that virus samples from the 1918 Spanish flu remained perfectly preserved and potentially active in exhumed bodies, creating a genuine biological hazard. To prevent the accidental creation of a frozen virus repository, the law now requires anyone who is terminally ill or nearing the end of their life to be transported to the Norwegian mainland before they pass away. The local cemetery hasn't accepted new burials since 1950. It's a bizarre situation where biology has literally forced a town to outlaw the one thing that no human has ever been able to avoid. If you lived in a place where dying was against the law, would you feel immortal or just incredibly anxious about the logistics? Rule 32. In early Rome, women were completely forbidden from drinking wine, and the punishment for violating this law was death. Roman law gave husbands the legal authority to execute their wives if they were caught consuming wine at any time. To enforce this prohibition, Roman men developed a ritualized greeting that doubled as a breathalyzer test. Male relatives would kiss female family members on the mouth specifically to check for the scent of wine on their breath. This meant every family gathering included mandatory alcohol inspections disguised as affectionate greetings. The reasoning behind the law varied. Some Romans believed wine would make women promiscuous, while others thought it would lead to other forms of disobedience. Whatever the justification, the consequence was clear. A woman's life could legally end over a single cup of wine. Do you think you could survive in a world where your favorite drink was a capital offense? Rule 33. Since 1839, London has maintained an official legal war against simple childhood pleasures through the Metropolitan Police Act. Section 54 of this Act specifically makes it illegal to fly a kite in any public street within the city. The same law also prohibits sliding on ice or snow in public areas. The original purpose was entirely practical. Kites could spook horses and cause dangerous accidents, while ice sliding created hazards for pedestrians on busy Victorian streets. However, the law remains technically active today, long after horses have left London's streets. This means that any child who launches a kite into the London sky is technically committing a public nuisance offence that could theoretically result in legal consequences. It's a strange artifact from an era when the government viewed string toys as genuine threats to public order. Does your city have any old laws this absurd still hiding in the books? Rule 34. The legendary Athenian lawmaker Solon introduced legislation that would be the absolute nightmare of anyone who enjoys relaxation. He created a legal mandate against idleness that made being unproductive a prosecutable offense. Under Solon's laws, any citizen who could not prove they had a steady source of income or were engaged in a productive trade could be brought before the courts by any member of the community. Repeat offenders faced the loss of their citizenship rights, including the ability to vote and participate in public life. The Athenians believed that every citizen had an obligation to contribute to society and that allowing people to simply exist without working was a danger to the state. Essentially, the government made it illegal to just vibe and enjoy life without documented employment. Imagine if the unemployment office didn't just give you benefits, but instead hold you to court for having too much free time on your hands. Rule 35 medieval England had a remarkable legal loophole that turned basic literacy into a literal get-out-of-death-free card. The benefit of clergy was originally a privilege reserved for members of the church, exempting them from the harsh punishments of secular courts. However, because literacy was rare among common people, the courts began using reading ability as a test for clergy status. If you could read a specific passage from the Bible, usually Psalm 51 known as the neck verse, you could claim clergy status and be tried in lenient church courts instead. Since church courts never impose the death penalty, this one skill could save your life. Criminals quickly learned this passage by heart, and eventually anyone who could recite it could escape execution. In a world where most crimes led to the gallows or worse, the ability to read a single paragraph was the difference between life and death. If one sentence stood between you and execution, how quickly would you master it? Rule 36, the Athenian lawmaker Draco was so famous for harsh punishments that his name gave us the word draconian. Among his most extreme laws was an anti-idleness statute that took Solon's later version to deadly extremes. Under Draco's original code, a person found to be persistently idle, meaning they had no visible means of income and spent too much time wandering without purpose, could face the ultimate penalty, death. The state viewed unproductive citizens as parasites who weakened society, and Draco believed the only solution was permanent removal. Later, reformers scaled back the punishment to fines and loss of rights, but the original message was brutally clear: produce for the state or die. It was the original hustle culture, except instead of motivational posters, the motivation came from an executioner standing in the corner. Do you think society would be more productive if taking a lazy day was punishable by law? Rule 37 in 18th century France. Bread was such a critical matter of national security that the government created a specialized police force dedicated entirely to baked goods. The bread police strictly regulated every aspect of bread production, including the price, weight, and ingredients of every loaf sold in the country. If a baker was caught selling an underweight loaf, using inferior flour, or charging above the official price, he could be dragged into the street and publicly humiliated in front of his neighbors and customers. The king was symbolically considered the first baker of the kingdom, and a bad harvest that led to bread shortages often triggered political crises. When Marie Antoinette allegedly suggested the poor eat cake, she was unknowingly poking at one of the most sensitive political issues of her time. The eventual failure of the bread system was a major factor in the French Revolution. It proves that when people are hungry enough, no amount of regulation can save a government from its 1660s. England introduced the hearth tax, one of history's most invasive and despised forms of taxation. The government assessed homes based on the number of fireplaces they contained, charging a fee for each hearth. To avoid the tax, poor families began bricking up their chimneys, leading to smoke-filled homes with dangerous air quality. Others modified their homes to share fireplaces between multiple rooms to reduce their taxable hearth count. But the truly invasive part was the enforcement. Tax collectors known as chimneymen had the legal authority to enter any private home at any time to count the number of fireplaces and verify tax payments. There was no privacy protection and no warrant required. Your home was subject to government inspection whenever they chose to appear. The tax turned every cozy fireplace into a symbol of government overreach and invasion of privacy. Would you brick up your heating source to avoid a tax, even if it meant freezing through winter? Rule 39. For 135 years, the British government treated cleanliness as a luxury worthy of taxation. The soap tax, enacted in the 17th century, added a levy that nearly doubled the price of soap for ordinary citizens. To prevent theft and tax evasion, the government required soap manufacturers to keep their soap pans locked at night under official seal. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. The tax made basic hygiene unaffordable for many working-class families who had to choose between food and cleanliness. The law essentially created a black market for soap, with smuggling and illegal manufacturing becoming common. For over a century, being clean was a privilege of the wealthy, while the poor were legally priced out of proper washing. The tax wasn't fully repealed until 1853, after which soap consumption skyrocketed. Do you think your government should have any say in how often you bathe, or is that taking taxation too far into personal life? Rule 40. Ancient Rome extended its legal control not just over citizens' actions, but over their very emotions. If a military leader or politician was declared an enemy of the state and executed for treason, their family was legally prohibited from mourning them publicly. Wearing black clothing, crying, or showing any sign of grief was considered an act of political defiance against the Roman state. The government believed that allowing public mourning for traitors would undermine national morale and create sympathy for enemies. This meant that families had to suppress their grief entirely or risk being charged with supporting treason themselves. The state was essentially dictating who you were allowed to miss and who you were required to forget. It's a chilling example of authoritarian control extending into the most private corners of human experience. Imagine being told by law exactly whose death you're permitted to grieve. Rule 41. In 1766, King Charles III of Spain passed a law banning long capes and wide-brimmed hats that triggered an actual revolution in the streets of Madrid. The king believed that these traditional Spanish garments allowed criminals to hide their identities and conceal weapons in the dark streets of the capital. His decree required citizens to adopt shorter capes and smaller hats that would make identification easier. What the king didn't anticipate was how deeply attached Spaniards were to their traditional fashion. The result was the Esquilache riots, massive popular uprisings in which thousands of citizens took to the streets to defend their right to dress as they chose. The riots became so severe that the king was forced to dismiss his ministers and scale back the law. It remains one of the few times in human history when a fashion restriction led to a full-scale national revolt. If your government suddenly banned your favorite hoodie for security reasons, would you comply quietly or would you start a revolution? Rule 42. The state of Vermont once had a law so intrusive that it attempted to regulate conversations between married couples in their own bed. According to this bizarrely specific old statute, it was technically illegal for a husband and wife to whisper to each other while lying in bed. The exact reasoning behind this law has been lost to history, leaving legal scholars and historians to speculate about what threat whispered marital conversations could possibly pose. Some suggest it was related to preventing conspiracy against the state, while others believe it may have been a misinterpretation of older common law. Whatever the original intent, it represents an astounding attempt by government to insert itself into the most private moments of citizens' lives. What could possibly be so dangerous about whispered secrets between spouses that lawmakers felt the need to prohibit it? Either those couples were discussing something truly revolutionary, or the lawmakers had simply run out of sensible things to regulate. Rule 43. The Philippines has created a legal weapon specifically designed to combat the age-old problem of neighborhood gossip. Under the revised penal code, the act of intriguing against honor is a punishable criminal offense. This law criminalizes the spreading of unverified rumors that could damage another person's reputation. In Filipino culture, a person who gossips excessively is called a marites, and this law is essentially the government's official anti-marites legislation. Unlike defamation laws in other countries that require formal lawsuits, this provision allows for criminal prosecution of rumor spreaders. It is probably the only country in the world where sharing unverified gossip about your neighbor could literally land you in a courtroom facing a judge. The law attempts to protect individuals from the social damage caused by malicious whisper campaigns and unfounded rumors. If your group chat were suddenly subject to Philippine law, how many If your friends would be facing
Rule
community
44,
service, the
spilling
ancient
tea.
Levitical laws of Israel included a fashion restriction that would effectively bankrupt most modern clothing retailers if enforced today. The prohibition of shatnez strictly forbade wearing any garment that combined wool and linen woven together in the same fabric. The theological reasoning behind this law was complex, involving concepts of maintaining proper order and respecting the distinct nature of different materials. However, the practical legal reality was absolute and applied to every citizen regardless of status. You could wear pure wool garments and you could wear pure linen garments, but the moment those two fabrics were combined in a single shirt, you became a legal pariah in the community. This meant that clothing had to be carefully inspected before purchase or wearing to ensure no forbidden mixture existed. Have you checked your clothing labels recently? Or are you unknowingly walking around as a secret fashion criminal according to ancient law? Rule 45. In 14th century Venice, the city authorities valued their peace and quiet so intensely that they criminalized bell ringing with severe punishments. It was strictly forbidden for any citizen to ring a bell at night unless there was an active fire, an enemy invasion, or some other genuine emergency. Violating this noise ordinance wasn't treated as a minor infraction. The punishment could include substantial fines or even public whipping. The law essentially made it a criminal offense to be a morning person who wanted to wake up early or a night owl who lost track of time. Church bells were exempt for religious purposes, but private citizens were expected to maintain absolute silence during nighttime hours. The Venetians took their sleep so seriously that a single unauthorized chime could result in a trip to the public square for corporal punishment. Imagine living in a city where accidentally bumping your wind chimes could lead to a court date and a very painful public correction. Rule 46. Since 1839, it has been technically illegal in London to carry a plank of wood along a public sidewalk. The Metropolitan Police Act specifically prohibits transporting timber, ladders, wheels, or any long objects on public footways unless you are in the active process of loading or unloading a vehicle. The law was originally intended to prevent Victorian construction projects from blocking busy pedestrian walkways and creating hazards for passers-by. However, the law remains technically enforceable today, meaning any DIY enthusiast carrying lumber home from the hardware store is potentially committing an offense. You could be a model citizen in every other respect, but the moment you try to walk down a London street with a 2x4 over your shoulder, you become a public nuisance in the eyes of the law. It's a perfect example of a sensible historical regulation that has far outlived its practical usefulness. Rule 47. For over 9 centuries, the English town of Dunmow has hosted a legal tradition that rewards marital harmony with bacon. The Dunmow Flitch trials allow any married couple to stand trial before a jury of 6 bachelors and 6 maidens to prove they have lived in perfect harmony for at least a year and a day. The couple must convince the jury that they have never once wished they were unmarried, never argued, and never regretted their decision to wed. If the jury is convinced of their wedded bliss, the couple is ceremonially paraded through the town and awarded a flitch, which is a massive side of cured bacon. This tradition has made it into actual English legal records and continues to this day. It is the ultimate English reward system where proving your marriage is perfect doesn't earn you a trophy, but rather a lifetime supply of breakfast meat. Could you and your partner maintain a convincing display of perfect harmony for an entire year just to win some bacon? Rule 48. In 1784, Great Britain added yet another item to its list of taxable luxuries: hats. The hat tax required every man's to have an official government stamp printed on the inside lining as proof that the tax had been paid. Retailers were required to purchase official stamps and apply them to every hat they sold, effectively turning hat makers into tax collectors for the government. Being caught wearing an unstamped hat could result in massive fines that would devastate ordinary workers. The government even went so far as to make forging or counterfeiting hat stamps a capital offense, meaning people could theoretically be executed for faking tax compliance on headwear. This turned every hat into a government document and made choosing to go bareheaded the only way to avoid the tax entirely. If you had to pay a monthly subscription fee to wear your favorite baseball cap today, would you pay up or embrace permanent hatlessness? Rule 49. For centuries, English law enforced a principle called mortmain, literally meaning dead hand, that reached beyond the grave to control how people disposed of their property. This legal doctrine prevented individuals from willing land or property to permanent institutions, particularly the Catholic Church, in their wills. The government feared that if the Church accumulated too much property through bequests, that land would never be sold, taxed, or redistributed again, essentially freezing the economy under the dead hand of perpetual religious ownership. The law required royal permission for any significant transfer of property to church control, and was designed to protect the Crown's tax base against erosion by pious donations. It was a remarkably forward-thinking piece of economic policy that recognized how accumulated institutional wealth could become a permanent drain on the national economy. It proves that even death cannot stop the government from worrying about its tax revenue. Rule 50. The 12 Tables of ancient Rome, one of the earliest codified legal systems in Western history, contained a provision so extreme that it proved even the most civilized societies can fear the power of words. The law stated that if any person wrote a satirical or defamatory poem about another citizen, what they called a carmen famosum, the punishment was death. This wasn't execution by the relatively merciful methods reserved for citizens. The guilty poet could be beaten to death by the offended party or by order of the magistrate. You could literally lose your life for writing a mean limerick or a catchy insult about someone in power. It was the original form of cancel culture, except instead of losing your social media account, you lost your ability to breathe. The Romans were so terrified of the power of a sick burn that they made wordsmithing a capital offense. It proves that, throughout human history, the pen truly has been considered more dangerous than the sword. Even ancient societies recognized that a well-crafted insult could bring down reputations, and they responded with the most extreme measure available.